Art History 1, Part 6. This is the Etruscans. The Etruscans were a people who lived in Italy, paralleling the time of the Greek development from the archaic phase of the Greeks, around 600 or so. They had already been moving in the similar direction to the Greeks, and they were developing sculpture and many of the different crafts. They made pots, and they were merchants. They had ships and went all around the Mediterranean, and they competed with and traded with the Greeks. Their civilization is more mysterious, though, because we don't know that much about them. Is very similar things between the Etruscans and the Greeks, but their religion was some different, their temples were some different, and their art was some different. It's just there are some influence that you can see, and we're going to look at the things that the Etruscans took from the Greeks. But when they were taking things from the Greeks, they decided to take some things and adapt them to their own sensibilities. The first work that we're looking at is called an Apollo. It's made of terracotta. It's life-size figure, and it's meant to go on top of a building. I'll show you in a minute how it fits on top of the building, but just look at this and consider first the technical problem of firing such a large piece of ceramic. This is the same material that would have been inside, or that would make up the pots that the Greeks used, and that process involved taking clay and turning it into a pot, and they pots of different sizes, and you let them dry, and once they're dry, they're very fragile at that point, and you put them in a kiln and you heat it to very high temperature for a long time, and it turns it into a kind of a stone-like material. But in this case, this is a very large thing. This is something that's it's over 6 feet tall, and as a result, you can imagine how difficult it would be to make this out of clay and have that clay dried out completely and have it in its fragile state to be put into a kiln and then fired for whatever time it takes to turn it into ceramic. So they were apparently very good at this, and they were able to do something far beyond what anyone else was doing with this kind of ceramic. Now the Greeks, of course, when they wanted to make a figure like this, they would make it out of stone, and for some reason the Etruscans didn't. They just didn't do much of the stonework. But let's look at the style of it. It's a standing figure. It's sort of striding forward, and it has a facial features and things that we can recognize from many things we saw in the Greek period. This is a very similar precedent from the Greeks, from the archaic phase. This has a figure where he's standing and he's one foot is forward, but the weight on the feet are completely even, and the arms are perfectly symmetrical, and the figure is standing otherwise perfectly symmetrical, and so it's an idealized figure. It's meant to be just to stand and be perfect, or at least within the developmental range that they were at the moment this was made. This was their idea of perfection, and we saw how that perfection changed from one instance to the other within the series of figures that were made in Greece. But they all, up until the very end, were all about a figure standing, not doing anything, and just essentially being. It was a very generalized figure with no expression and no story being told, and not even a specific person. Maybe it could represent a god, it could represent an athlete, it could be just an idealized figure. This figure by the Etruscans, on the contrary, is it represents a god. It's Apollo, and instead of being standing straight up, he seems to be striding. So he's actually moving. None of the Kouros figures in the Greek sequence were moving, or they seemed to move at all. And so it's a story is being told. This is part of a figural group of four. It has Hercules as one of the figures, and they're acting out a story from Hercules' labors. So that's different, the movement. Also, it's not nude. The the Greek kouros figures, all the male figures in the Greek history, from archaic up into the classic, it was perfectly normal for the Greeks figures to be nude, and that was because in their culture, nudity was the ideal state. But apparently they were alone in this, and the other civilizations around the Mediterranean didn't do that. But they did like, when they looked at the Greek things, they liked many of the aspects of their art that the Greeks had made. And in this case, the artist took some aspects, that is the standing figure, many aspects of, the proportions of the figures are similar to an archaic type. But the putting clothes on it is something that was an Etruscan thing. Let me look at one instance where they could have gotten the clothes. This is a Greek, not a kouros, but a kouroi figure that is a female figure. And the Greeks, when they did female figures at this period, always put them with drapery on them. And so let's look at the way the drapery looks. It has these long, straight, or curvy pleats that have a hard edge to them, and it creates a linear pattern and a sequence of things, a rhythm of lines that go and they curve together, and they have this zigzaggy quality to them to make it decorative, imaginative patterns around the figure. Well, looking back at the Etruscan, you can see that the Etruscan artist has done a similar thing that the Greeks would do in a female figure, that is the way that's draped. These draperies are little pleated lines that come, they're very sharp edged, just like the Greeks, and they make interesting decorative patterns on the surface of the figure. It's not meant to look, exactly the way actual fabric works on a person. So it's an artificial, stylized thing. But evidently the Etruscans didn't see nudity the same way that the Greeks did. Also, look at the eye. This is the side of his face here. Look at the way the eye sort of bulges out in a kind of way there. Well, the Greek in the same time also had eyes that did that. And also just generally the face is very similar, especially the way the mouth works and the little indentations on either side that sort of give rise to the notion of the archaic smile. And the Etruscan face, has that same sort of mouth thing, same sort of eye thing, but the overall look of the face is different, as if the Etruscans had a different sensibility as to what their ideal face was, but the way they rendered it, in at least the mouth and the eyes, is similar to the Greeks. Also, the stylization of the hair is not exactly the same hairstyle, but it is similarly stylized and artificial looking. You can see it from the back, rope-like tresses back here. You can see how they've worked it all the way around with the pleatings and things going all around. You can see it also has a hole in it. It was a hollow thing, so is to diminish the weight and also make it so that so it could be fired all the way through. It has this thing in the middle. Let's see, between the legs here. It's a device. As a technical device, it needs to have something to help it hold it up during the construction phase of it. And also, it would be very vulnerable to breaking at the legs, at the ankles here, if it didn't have something else to hold it up. And this sort of thing looks kind of vaguely like an architectural decoration, which is consistent with the building that it's on, as if he were like stepping over something that was already there. Here's a picture of it with the pairing of the figure that goes with it. This is Hercules, and it's rendered in a different manner. And we're just looking at the way the Etruscans copied the Greeks in this particular case. But here we see what it looks like in its place. This is the figure we're talking about. And Hercules and the other figures are part of a story that go on top of this building. We're going to look at the building too, because part of the interest of what we're looking at for the Etruscans is how they took some things from the Greeks, but maintained some other things. And what we're going to see is that the Romans that come after them did the same thing. They were absorbed into the Romans. As the Romans increased, they decreased. But the Romans kept much of the sensibility, that is, liking the Greek things for some aspects of it, but in accepting some and incorporating some into their own culture, but also maintaining the things that they like that are different. In this case, this is what a temple looked like in the Etruscan era. They had it's similar to the Greeks in that there's a group of columns holding up a roof with a triangular pediment on the front, and it's raised up with steps. But instead of having steps all around, it only has steps in the front. So that means you approach it from one side, and it has an axis, and you go through the center. The Greeks, remember, their temples were approached from all sides. Also, the proportions of the roof to the columns and the rest of the building is different proportions, and the roof hangs over much farther. Having all these figures standing on it is also a different thing that the Etruscans had. We look at the ground plan. It has a cella, like the Greeks had, with columns, but this orientation of just a box here with a front porch is not what the Greeks had. So the idea of a cella with a porch is something they must have already had, and they adapted some things from the Greeks, like, say, the columns. Originally, they probably would have had wooden columns, and then they would have made them out of stone later. But the shape of the columns with the capitals and bases, we can see similar things in Greece as well. In fact, this capital goes all the way back to the Minoans. Their columns had this kind of capital to them. Having a Doric capital and with a base is not something the Greeks did. So this style, as it later came to be known, was called Tuscan, which is the name of the area where the Etruscans lived. Again, copying some things and not copying and maintaining their own style is a hallmark of these Etruscans, and it will be again a hallmark of the Romans when they get absorbed. When the Etruscans get absorbed into them, the Romans will also take things when they make their own temples. Will have aspects of this, but also aspects of the Greeks blended in a different way than the Etruscans did. I also want to show this to give an example of another aspect that the Romans are going to have that they didn't get from Greece, but they got it from the Etruscans. That is the arch. This is a gateway to a city on a hill that is fortified, and these are the great big fortifications on either side of the gate. And this is the opening where you go through to get into the city. And this is a thing that can be defended by archers up here, and soldiers can defend this city by just maintaining cover over this gate. And because it's such a wide opening, you need to put a span across it that's not going to fall in. And you don't want to make it out of wood, and you have to make it out of stone. And one piece of stone that went all the way across would probably not be very, very good because it would break. The post and lintel style of architecture that the Greeks had wouldn't work in this instance. And although the Etruscans didn't invent the arch, they did use it a lot, and as a main way of making things stand up when they needed things that were when they had this sort of situation. What we're going to see later is that the Romans will also take this. They will have arches as well as the main structural element for the buildings. But look at this stuff up here. This is a decorative frieze that's made to look kind of like a Doric frieze that's on the entablature of a Doric building that has alternating triglyphs and metopes, and with metopes that have shields in them. Instead of triglyphs, they have little imitations of columns called pilasters. That is, they're flat columns, but they're sort of diminutive. They're shortened so that the whole length of the column is in this space. but they occupy the space in the that would be occupied by triglyphs in a Doric frieze. But notice that Doric friezes are part of post and lintel architecture, but this is not a post and lintel thing. The post and lintel aspect of this is just a decorative surface thing, nothing to do with the structure. Columns hold up lintels in one technical type of architecture, and arches hold up things in this kind of architecture, but they liked the look of the post and lintel thing, so they added it as a decorative feature. Look, here's one other instance of a Etruscan arch with similar applied decoration that is unrelated to the structure. That is, applying decoration is something that the Greeks didn't do. Their columns weren't decorating the building, they were actually holding the building up. The structure of Greek architecture was entirely visible. I mean, everything that you saw was the structure, and they just made those structural elements, refined and as beautiful as possible in terms of proportion and organization and composition of all of their pieces. But the structure was the same thing as the building. The Etruscans, and then later the Romans after them, have a different concept. Their concept is the structure is something that holds the building up, that is a sort of an internal thing. And what goes on the surface is are decorative things. And the things that they thought of as decorative were the components of Greek architecture, that is columns, entablatures, capitals, all of those moldings and things that the Greeks put on things for decorations, they would faithfully copy. Now here the Etruscans are not particularly faithful. If you look at this, isn't exactly like a Doric frieze, and these aren't exactly like Greek columns. But when we get to the Roman era, the Romans will faithfully copy exactly how the Greeks would do something in terms when they make their decoration. But they will, completely ignore what the Greeks did as far as their structure. Okay, when we get to the Romans in the next video, we'll see how they approached sculpture.